church benches and into the trenches. Let's make a righteous ruckus.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Righteous Ruckus podcast. I'm your host, Riley Lowe, and today I'm going to continue with part two. The last episode was the cosmological argument for the existence of God, and that was I focused more on the scientific side of things, and this time I want to focus more on the philosophical, which, of course, all philosophy or all science is based on philosophy. I think the way I described it last episode was actually a pretty good description off the top of my head. Basically, you can have a house of science, but the foundation under the house has to be philosophy. You can't have science without the laws of logic and the rules of philosophy. It's just the way it is. So, did the universe have a beginning, or has it existed from eternity past? Right? If it did have a beginning, did it have a creator? What created the universe? So, like I said, last time we looked at it scientifically. This time we're going to look at it philosophically. And sometimes the scientific side of things registers with people differently than the philosophical side of things registers with people. It's just the way different people's minds work. And my mind, I thoroughly enjoy more of the philosophical side of things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that would resonate with you. You know what I mean? So, the philosopher Aristotle, a lot of people are familiar with him. He was I think he was the one that came up with the unmoved mover, right? As far as arguing for God. But he actually thought that the universe had existed in eternity past, or from eternity past, right? So he thought that there had always been a universe, right? Which there was another philosopher came along later. His name was Al-Ghazali, and he disagreed, and he said if the universe did not have a beginning, then the number of past events in history is infinite, which means it can't happen. So the problem with that is it's what you would call absurdity, right? So an actual infinite number of past events is absurd. It is. And I'll give you some examples here that kind of make you think about that. Because a lot of people, if you were to say, an infinite number, that the universe has existed forever, for infinity, right? A lot of people would be like, oh, I don't know about that. And then if you throw out, oh, well, Stephen Hawking says this, or this, whatever these people, that's an appeal to authority. And it's like, oh, well, just because they say it doesn't mean it's true. It could be true. It could be true, but it also could be false. Just because some smart person says something doesn't make it so. But it's metaphysically impossible. Now, metaphysically is just one of those big words. It's just a way to describe the fundamental nature of reality. So metaphysical is just the way things are, is all that means. But why is it impossible to have a universe that's always existed? Right? Why is that impossible? To have a universe that's existed from an infinite past. Well, there's a decent illustration. There's a guy called David Hilbert. It's called Hilbert's Hotel. It's actually a little bit deep for me to grasp fully, but I definitely understand it. It basically shows this absurdity by talking about a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, and you have an infinite number of guests in those rooms, and somebody else comes to check in. Well, all the infinite numbers of rooms are taken out. Well, you can just simply check them in, because the number of rooms available is infinite. Even though there's an infinite number of people occupying those infinite rooms, you can still add another one because it's still infinite. Because the reality is infinity is more of a description than an actual thing, honestly, especially infinity past. But so it's a little hard to grasp. There's actually it goes a lot deeper than that, a lot of examples. The whole point of that exercise is just to show the absurdity of thinking that there could be an infinite number of an infinite past, an infinite number of anything basically. But there's one other one I like that's actually a little bit more easy to grasp. Dr. William Lane Craig has this example where he says, if Saturn completes one orbit around the sun in the same time it takes Jupiter to complete 2 orbits around the sun, if we wait until 10 years from now, it would stand to reason that Jupiter, since it completes 2 orbits for every 1 orbit that Saturn completes, would have more orbits accumulated around the sun. But if it's been happening forever, for eternity past, then they actually have the same number of orbits, which is an infinite number of orbits, right? And it just doesn't make sense. There's another one I like, the domino example. It basically says that, if you have a line of dominoes, right? And you push over the dominoes and they start going along the line of dominoes, you eventually get to that last domino. We could call that last domino today, right? And that would make sense. But you can't have an infinite number of dominoes that are collapsing and falling over and arrive at the last domino, because there would always be another domino to knock over before you were to knock over that last domino, which would be today. So we would never get to today. There's an example, I think Frank Turek uses this example of drawing a line. I've heard him say this, whereas say you take a pencil and you start at a line and you start drawing it. You could start at that line and go and draw an infinite line into the future, but you can't have always been drawing that line and arrive at any point on the line. Does that make sense? So if I take this pencil and I started here and I start drawing, I could go on, hypothetically, I could go on forever. However, I can't have always been drawing this line and arrive here, because I would always have more line to draw, right? I could never arrive right here where my pencil is right now, because I would have always been drawing a line. Makes sense. I thought of one the other day, running a race, right? You can, if you started at the start line and ran a race, you could get to the finish line. But if you were always running the race, you would never get to the finish line, because you would have more race to run all the time. You would never make any progress, and you would never arrive at the finish line. I've heard Frank Turek mention this one too, about a calendar. We would never. This is the first time I ever even heard this concept. It was years ago, and I was listening to Frank Turek's podcast. Actually, I think it's on a radio show that time, and he says the universe cannot be eternal, because if there were an infinite number of days before today, we would never arrive at today. And I was like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. That may be how some of you all are feeling right now. But if you think about it, now we could start with a day and keep adding one day after another and get to today. But we can't have always had days in the past, or else we would never be progressing to get to today. There would always be more days before we got to today, because we got an infinite number of days in the past. Infinity, like I said, is a descriptor basically. And you'll hear people say, "Oh no, it can be infinitely in the past. It could have always existed. The universe could have, but it just doesn't make sense." Or you'll hear people say, "Well, there's an infinite number of numbers, but do numbers really exist? They are a thought. They're not tangible, is what I mean. So they're not space. They're not limited by space, time, or material. So numbers, there is an infinite number of numbers, but it's not like anybody could count to that number, or actually you can have the concept of having an infinite past number of numbers, but you can't actually have that, if that makes sense whatsoever. So really, what does that leave us with? Basically, the argument goes like this. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe has a beginning. So the universe had a cause. And people like to say, I've heard people say, well, the universe created itself. Well, the Big Bang just happened or whatever. Well, that can't happen because for the universe to create itself, it would have to be outside the universe in order to create the universe. And that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make logical sense. So what we're left with is a universe that created out of nothing. There was no space, no time, no material, so nothing. So what caused that? No, whatever caused it would have to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, because they had to have that, and intelligent to know how to do it, personal to decide how to do that. And these are all attributes that we would attribute to what, me as a Christian call God. And so does this argument mean that, does this thought process, this cosmological argument, even the last episode and this episode, like the last episode, I had some people saying, oh, this doesn't make any sense. That doesn't mean the Bible's true. Well, I didn't say it meant the Bible's true. It just means that it's very likely that God is this cause, right? This is just one of multiple examples and multiple arguments for the existence of God. All this is a tool in your tool belt to help reassure you and go through these thought exercises of drawing a line or the dominoes or infinite days or running the race. Think about that stuff, and it helps you grasp the concept that we can't have, the universe cannot have always existed. There had to be a time where the universe did not exist and came into existence. So it had to have a cause. Now, people will argue and say, well, then what caused God? Well, God is the unmoved mover, like I mentioned earlier. God is the uncaused first cause, right? God is not limited by space, time, or matter. God is outside of all that. He can operate inside of it, but he's also outside of all that. He is, well, he says it right when Abraham asks, who are you? Who should I tell him you are? He says, I am, right? I am. So that I am is basically all encompassing, right? And it's really cool to think about that. So what this is, these arguments, the apologetic arguments, are tools in your tool belt to reassure you, to embolden your faith, to help encourage you with the reality that you have a reasonable faith, that it's not a blind faith. Like our pastor Paul Blair even has a book. It's called Not Blind Faith by Paul Blair. I encourage you to check that out. It's like super tiny. It's more like a pamphlet, where it just covers these basic things at a 30,000 foot view that is super easy to grasp. So all I gotta say is that these are tools to help reassure you that this is a reasonable faith. This is not just grasping at straws. And what you see, the deeper you get into these exercises of apologetics, when it comes to your faith, you'll see that actually it's the people that claim the atheistic view or the materialistic view of their worldview that is actually grasping at straws that are not there, man. They're just not there. So anyway, I encourage you to grow stronger in your faith. And ultimately, no apologetics is a substitute for just reading the Word of God, right? Read the words of the Creator. But all this is a tool in your tool belt. So time to go out there and get to work.